Jason from Rhode Island, starting at Bash at the Beach, 1996. WCW fans regularly littered the ring with debris and anything they could get their hands on. It seemed like at the height of the NWO, it was a regular occurrence on Nitro. Why was this allowed? Was it encouraged by Eric Bischoff? I don't remember people throwing stuff in the ring in WWE during the Attitude Era. Yeah, it was very uncommon in WWE. I mean, people could throw stuff anytime they wanted to, but you didn't see that in WWE the way you did in WCW. Eric Bischoff has said they never encouraged it, but they loved it because it just made for a great visual. And look, it definitely added to the Hogan heel turn at Bash at the Beach. Just the visual of all that trash in the ring around Mean Gene Okerlund as he stood there trying to interview Hogan, and people throwing trash at Hogan and Hall and Nash. It was a hell of an image. But it's not something that they should be, tolerating anymore, and they don't. As far as why it happened in WCW and not in WWE, I always associated it with being more of a Southern wrestling thing. People would do that a lot in the territory days, especially if you had a hot heel that the people hated. They believed back then. They believed it was real. A lot of people did. A lot of them... again, you would hear these stories. You still hear these stories. Tales from the Territories. I covered that whole first season of Tales from the Territories. And there were plenty of stories about unruly fans, whether it was the Carolinas, or it was in Kentucky, or it was in Florida, or it was in Georgia, or wherever it might be. It seemed to be more in the southern part of the country, typically. But, again, we're talking about a lot of the southern territories here. That you would have people throwing stuff and attacking wrestlers and heels, coming after them with knives and guns and stuff. I mean, this was commonplace back then. Wrestlers, they took their life in their own hands. If you were a hot heel, you were taking your life in your hands every time you went out there to the ring. And trying to get back to the locker room would be like literally fighting for your life sometimes. It was more, I think, of something you saw in the territory days than you did later on. And WCW I looked at WCW as more of a Southern wrestling promotion even after all they brought, or even after they brought all, I should say, the big names in and they expanded nationally. To me, they were always still that Southern wrestling promotion because they were based out of Atlanta and it always had that Southern influence, which was very different than what you would traditionally see in WWE. It was just a different take on wrestling. I grew up watching WWE, so I grew up with the cartoony gimmicks and Hulk Hogan fighting off all the giants. And I didn't grow up watching Jim Crockett Promotions. I would see pieces of it. I would go over to my grandfather's house, and he had cable, so I could see WCW Saturday Night and some of the other programming that I couldn't see at home. And I enjoyed what I saw in some cases. In other cases, I thought it was boring because just that wasn't what wrestling was to me. But you could always see the difference where it was taken more seriously. Not that you didn't have goofy gimmicks later on like in WCW. The fucking ding-dongs and that kind of stuff. But, that mid-'80s, late 80s, NWA, WCW, I mean, it was a more serious style of wrestling, where the wrestling and the stories and the personal issues were the focus. And it was just more of, it was more theater, I guess you would say, in WWE. It was more about these larger than life, just over the top, outlandish characters in a lot of cases. And I think that also played a role, frankly, in how the crowds responded. Maybe the crowds looked at WWE at the time for what it was. It was a product geared towards kids. So you had all these families that would come to these shows with these kids and these, teenagers. And you're not going to have little kids and families throwing garbage in the ring at the fucking Beverly Brothers, right? It just wasn't going to happen. And in the NWA, it was very different. It was very different. It was more adult oriented, and there was a lot of blood, and there was just a lot of, it felt real. Those guys made it feel real to a lot of people. And how do people lash out if they see a guy they don't like? They spit on them. They throw garbage on them. I mean, that's what people did. And honestly, when I think of WCW, it really was just the NWO stuff. Like during that period, I don't remember seeing a whole lot of garbage being thrown in for anyone else's segments. I think after Bash at the Beach, it became the cool thing to do whenever the NWO was out there. And WCW did nothing to discourage it. And I know they would have David Penzer, like in the announcements before the show, in front of the live crowd, telling them that, you shouldn't be throwing stuff, or, that won't be tolerated, or it's prohibited, or however they phrased it. But it's not as if they really took any great action to discourage it as it was continuing to happen. And that's pretty shitty for the talent. Imagine being out there having cups of God knows what being thrown at your head, or batteries being thrown at you. Scott Steiner got hit in the head on TV once with an egg. I certainly would hope that person was in like the 10th row or something, far away from the ring. I don't know how wise it would be if you're sitting in the first 3 rows to throw anything at Scott Steiner. Your life would be flashing before your eyes. But yeah, I was in like late 98, early 99, somewhere around then. It was some segment with Goldberg. So there was more WCW certainly could have done to discourage it. So yeah, they might not have encouraged it, but they basically did. Without saying so, they basically encouraged it because they thought it was cool. They thought it was a cool visual.